Hello everyone, my name is John Hallman from OneSpin Solutions, and I will be presenting with my colleague, Jean-Philippe Martin of Intel, and on behalf of our committee chairman, Brent Sherman, also of Intel. Our presentation introduces a new Accellera standard for IP security assurance called SA-EDI, Security Annotation for Electronic Design Integration. For our presentation, I will introduce the IP security challenge in the industry and the efforts that have been ongoing over the past several years. I will then turn it over to Jean-Philippe, who will cover the IP security methodology in more detail, describe the growing security weakness knowledge base, and then run through a simple example that exercises the standard. Finally, we will wrap things up and take a few final questions. We are here to discuss the growing security risks in many of our electronic products, many of which have become so prevalent in our lives today. Who, for instance, couldn't live without a computer or a cell phone, or the ICs in cars and planes? In a $1.5 trillion U.S. economy, security breaches have increased 11% in the past year alone. Hacking toolkits have become extremely cheap, ranging from $1 to $200 just to get started. Staggering statistics like ransomware attacks happening every 14 seconds, or the mention of new attacks like the SolarWinds exploit are regularly mentioned in the mainstream news. And these attacks are not just limited to software anymore. The graphic on the right shows the common vulnerabilities that have been tracked in software over the last 2 decades, but now we are starting to track such data in our hardware and ICs as well. So why is security so critical on hardware IP blocks? Similar to hardware functional bugs, security bugs are just as costly to fix and can cause recalls or respins if not caught in time. There are added risks in using IP, especially if the IP has not been thoroughly verified. Security is often used as a non-functional requirement, so integrators often do not realize the true impact of an IP block on the product or the entire system. Hardware IP blocks, often embedded in the most privileged entities of the system, are in prime position for a potential attacker to influence or exploit the system. There have been several other efforts that have begun to address security or the impact of security. However, none have covered the security assurance for IP blocks and ICs in such detail. In the automotive world, standards have been built on top of the functional safety model, like 21434, but even this does not address hardware components specifically, and certainly does not dive down to the IP level inside those components. Further standards efforts are needed to help guide creators and implementers of these IP blocks toward better security. Leaders in the industry recognized the need for this type of guidance and began the security assurance standardization efforts back in the 2017 timeframe. The paper referenced here was a good starting point, but it was a limited sample size, had limited participation, addressed and fixed a stagnant problem, and did not support the opportunity for growth. As I'm sure you're aware, security is a fast-moving target, and attackers are continuously finding new ways to exploit products. The IP Security Assurance Working Group fits into the Accellera body as one of the technical committees. Accellera is an independent nonprofit organization and, as shown in the graphic, has many committees dedicated to improving design verification processes in the electronics industry. In this organizational structure, the IPSA work group kicked off in the late 2018 time and has begun marching towards a published standard ever since. The IPSA working group is currently made up of 18 companies, 1 university, and has a total of 60 participating members. The committee consists of large chip manufacturers, IP providers, IP integrators, and electronic design automation tool providers. The committee has a broad knowledge of security background that includes both research and industry experience. One of the first major accomplishments of the group was to release a white paper to describe the proposed upcoming standard. The white paper described the initial methodology, a common IP security concern enumeration or knowledge base, and an initial example from OpenCourse. This white paper is still available from the Accellera website at the following URL listed here. Since the white paper, the IPSA workgroup has made some significant updates to the overall methodology and knowledge base. As the recognition of the MITRE Common Weakness Enumeration, or CWE as more commonly referenced, has grown and now includes hardware weaknesses, the committee has more openly referenced the CWE standard in the standard itself. The CWE is a common reference to describe security weaknesses in architecture, design, or even the code itself. It began with focus on software, but now has just passed over 100 hardware weaknesses. Industry continues to promote this common database, and new weaknesses continue to be added, some even from this IPSA workgroup. More information on the CWEs can be found at cwe.mitre.org, as shown here in the graph. That brings us back to SA-EDI, the standard for Security Annotation for Electronic Design Integration. The end goal will be to have an IEEE standard format. A rough draft has been completed, and the subgroup is working on the final review. We are going to be very close to our public release goals of February or March of this year, and are currently working toward proof of concept demo and supplemental materials to be available later this year. If all goes well, we could be back in the DAC timeframe to be able to give a live demonstration of the standard. That concludes the introduction section. Let me turn it over to Jean-Philippe, who will now discuss the SA-EDI methodology.
Thank you, John. So let's look at the methodology for SA-EDI. First and foremost, let's understand the objectives of the Security Annotation for Electronic Design Integration standard. First, the goal here is to improve trustworthiness of IPs and their providers. Second, assist IP integrators in reducing risk by understanding IP security. And lastly, this provides a common specification for EDA companies to develop automated solutions for security assurance. So how does SA-EDI help with IP delivery? This existing IP delivery or integration flow might look like as follows. An IP is designed, and then before it's sent to a customer, go through various steps, right? So whatever goes into the IP bundle that is delivered to the customer might be the RTL design, specific synthesis, place and route scripts and constraints, and sometimes also verification collaterals such as test bench and basic tests. The bundle gets sent to the customer, and the integrator is left with little or no understanding of what security has been put into the IP and what are the security risks. So with a SA-EDI enhanced flow, the IP providers generates and includes annotation for security, and such collateral gets added to the delivery, and the integrator can retrieve such security annotation to gain confidence in security of the IP. So from the point of view of the IP provider, at a high level, what extra information does a bundle with SA-EDI include? First, a database that lists the assets of the IP. Next, elements that may influence the security of the IP and the assets, such interface configurations. The attack point security objective and associated mitigation. And then some other elements that may be generated automatically. The RTL, the backend scripts, the netlist, the verification collaterals, and the SA-EDI collaterals gets bundled together. There's various steps to follow to create an IP bundle with SA-EDI. First, identify assets. Second, identify a specific database. We'll talk about that specific database. Generate elements, data objects. Create the attack point security objectives. And finally, generate the IP bundle. On the integration side, what are the various portion of a workflow that would include SA-EDI? So the IP bundle is received by the IP integrator and contain more than just the RTL or test bench, right? It might also include SA-EDI collaterals, which are composed of database element and APSO. The SA-EDI can be then verified by the integration team or the integrator by using EDA tools. And finally, the integrator may validate that the security objective of the unbundled IP is still maintained at the system level. So what are the steps at integration? First, verify that there are SA-EDI data objects in the bundle. Then, using RTL and asset definition objects, regenerate the elements. Compare the elements generated with the original element in the IP bundle, and the expectation is that SA-EDI collateral should match the RTL. From there, decide which of the IP's attack point security objectives are relevant to the integrating system. That becomes part of the product threat model. Next, identify additional APSO objects that would complement the one from the IP. And then perform verification of the threat model at the integration level. We'll pause here for questions regarding the overall methodology before diving into understanding more about the knowledge base and going through a specific example. Let's look at the security weakness knowledge base. What is a security weakness knowledge base, also known as SWKB? It's a database or repository that contains security concerns that are associated with hardware IPs and their integration. It does not represent a specific database. Could use as reference existing database such as the MITRE common weakness enumeration. Can also reference a proprietary database and allow for use of multiple databases. It has APIs to allow software to query the database. So what does an entry in the SWKB contain? Each entry shall describe a title, a unique identifier, a reference number, description, consequences, applicability, modes of introduction, and mitigations. So how is the SWKB used in the SA-EDI standard? APIs are defined to allow for software queries in order to aid in automation of the SA-EDI steps. So let's dive into a simple example. As an example, we'll use a watchdog IP, we'll call it WD IP, which consists of two basic blocks instantiated within the WD top module. The two instances are of WD control and WD count. This IP functionality is to implement a watchdog that would signal once the counter reaches a specific limit. Here are the steps as described in the upcoming standard. There are steps for the IP provider and there are steps for the IP integrator. So we'll go over them first for the IP provider and then for the IP integrator. The first step for the IP provider is to identify assets. So For this specific example, we have identified WD timer, which holds the timeout value of the watchdog. Then we identify WD asset timeout, which is also critical for proper operation, and that makes it an asset. They're highlighted here in black and purple. We'll keep track of the WD timer value throughout the example. So the way it's described here is the current syntax to define it as an asset for this standard. So the next step is to specify a specific security weakness knowledge base for the tools. With the EDA tool, generate the element data. So here, since we identify WD count.WD timer, the tool will allow to find specific weaknesses that could be associated with the logic or the structure. The next step is to create the attack point security objectives. So to create the APSO data objects for the timer asset, the security objective is integrity. It needs to be upheld, since this is what an adversary would want to alter. One may argue that confidentiality is also applicable, since knowing the timer's count does allow the adversary to know when the timeout could happen, and therefore, mount an attack in a timely manner. However, without preventing a timeout, the attack does not get mounted and will be undone when the timeout occurs. So therefore, the confidentiality objective does not really improve the security of the design. It will ensure that the APSO for the data objects WD timer are as follow. So we have one which would be, if the log bit is not enabled, then the counter should not be altered. So this is a reference to a specific security weakness reference. We have the list here. Also, the debug signals may alter the counter. So that's another place where the integrity might be violated. Next, this gets packaged and bundled. So the IP provider might create a tar of the RTL, netlist, test bench, test constraints, and so on, and the SA-EDI data objects produced in step 1, 2, 3, and 4. For example, WD IP bundle is created, a tarball. Note that when you deliver an IP, it's great to create a checksum or digital signature, right, when transmitting to customers. So let's look at what the IP integrator ought to do. First step, which is the 6th in our flow, is to unbundle and inspect. So the integrator will untar the received bundle and will inspect the archive to ensure that it contains SA-EDI data objects. Using the EDA tool, the integrator will regenerate the SA-EDI objects directly from the RTL and ensures that the SA-EDI elements delivered match the one that are generated. Lastly, the integrator will remove specific APSO or add specific APSO to match what is necessary or relevant to the integrating system. For example, SO security objective number 2 might not be a concern if there's no debug port connected to that IP. Step 10 would be to complete the threat model. So to complete the threat model, there may be some specific security objectives that pertain to how the WD-top block is architected in the IC. For example, OW reset signal may not be gated and therefore requires the security objective availability. And then the integrator would add the following APSO object to the threat model. Notice that some of the optional attributes are not included in the object because their values are not needed. And then the IP integrator will ensure the objectives are upheld at the system level. So the last step is to verify that the security objectives in the threat model are upheld at the integrating system. For example, verify that SA-1 is true by trying to prevent a timeout assertion via the WD control block interface once the log bit is set. Or for SA-2, verify that deprivileged agents do not have access to the debug signals. These are just examples. That concludes the example. The verification process is not part of the standard. Now for the conclusion, I'll turn it over to John.
Thank you, Jean-Philippe, for covering the detailed methodology and walking us through the example. In conclusion, let's take a look at the roadmap for future efforts in the standard and briefly review what was covered here today. As noted here, the standard is in review and is on track to be released later this quarter as an Accellera standard. In time, we anticipate this becoming an IEEE standard, but that time frame is still yet to be determined. In addition to the standard, the workgroup also plans to release a user guide to better provide detailed information for users of the standard. And as mentioned earlier, the group is also working on a proof of concept demo. We anticipate this demo to be ready around the DAC timeframe, and we'll certainly announce when it's ready. In summary, we believe that this standard has achieved all of its requirements originally set out by the group. We have defined detailed security requirements and objectives outside the design with simple reference tags and minimal tools. This implementation is very low overhead and minimally disruptive to the design and verification flows of today. It is very flexible and scalable as it applies not only existing IP, but also anticipates larger and more complex designs. And finally, it utilizes EDA tools to auto-generate data and verify that the RTL matches the security attributes. Please look for an announcement from Accellera that the standard is complete and ready for use later this year. With that, we want to thank you for your time and for your attention, and we are now ready for questions.